Hello, everyone. This is Mrs. G Storytime, and we are reading The Tanglewood Secret by Patricia Sanjan by permission of Moody Publishing Company. We are on Chapter 14, A Moonlight Adventure. We went to see Terry very often during the next few weeks, and I believe now that it was only our visits that kept him alive through those long, dark days when he lay flat on his aching back, staring at the wall. Philip lent him all his most precious nature books, and we took him all the chocolate we had and baskets of fruit from the orchard. We felt well rewarded every time by the look of pleasure on his white cheeks and the flicker of happiness that would light up his eyes. He never thanked us in words, and his mother still stared at us as though she hated us. But we knew, nevertheless, that Terry's waking hours were spent wondering if we would come, and that he would leave from dinner time onward with his eyes fastened on the door and his ears straining for the sound of our footsteps. We told Aunt Margaret about him, and once or twice she had sent him a little presents. Aunt Margaret and I were slowly getting to understand each other, and I no longer tried to avoid helping her in the mornings. At first I did my job because I thought I ought to, but after a few days I found that housework really was quite fun, as long as I was doing my best and not trying to get out of it all the time. My aunt said nothing, but I knew she was pleased at the change, and gradually we grew fond of each other, and I began to talk to her more freely instead of keeping everything a secret from her. Uncle Peter was interested in Terry, too, and once or twice he took the stepladder to the orchard and picked the most enormous rosy apples that grew right at the top of the tree against the sky for us to take to him. They were the size of big grapefruits, and when we polished them up, we could see our faces in their shiny skins. Terry loved them, and even his mother looked interested. "Did you pick those in your garden?" she asked suddenly one afternoon as we placed one of them between his small white hands. We quite jumped, for except for her first greeting, it was the first time she had ever spoken to us. We turned smiling towards her, for we wanted her to come to like us as much as Terry did. "Yes," I answered. "We've lots of trees full of big shining apples like these. We shall be picking them in about a week, and then we'll bring some more. But we picked these early because we thought Terry would like them." She only grunted and turned away, but I could not help feeling pleased that she had spoken to us and admired our apples. I thought I would try and talk to her again tomorrow. The nights just then were very hot, owing to the very extra summertime. It did not get dark until late. Philip and I used to kick our bedclothes onto the floor and lie in our night things by the open windows trying to get cool. Often I got tired of lying alone and would go and sit on his bed. We would talk until the cool darkness gathered around us and we felt ready for sleep. It was one of those hot, still nights when the sky was still red with the last glow of sunset that I tiptoed across the passageway and found Philip with his head out the window. I pushed up a little and stuck my head out beside him. In the distance we could hear a sheep cry among the rocks. "I don't think I shall ever go to sleep tonight, Phil," she remarked. "It's such a beautiful night, and I still want to look out the window all the time. It's a full moon, too. Look, I can see it coming up behind the fir tree." We watched it climb above the horizon, almost blood-red in color, and it seemed all tangled up in the black boughs of the fir tree, but it would soon steer clear, and all the world would be flooded with a soft silver light. I turned suddenly to Philip, my head full of moonlight madness. "Phil," I whispered excitedly, "have you ever been out on the hills at night?" "No," answered Philip, "I haven't. Not proper night. Why?" "Oh, Philip," I breathed, giving his arm a little squeeze, "let's go now, just out through the hedge, up above the quarry. It would be so beautiful, just you and me and the big yellow moon. Come on, Phil." Philip hesitated. "Do you think it would be very naughty?" he asked. "After all, you know, we were going to try to be good these holidays." "I know," I urged, "and we really have been rather good, too. I've been cross with Aunt Margaret once or twice, but last holidays I was cross nearly every day. And it isn't really a bit naughty either. After all, what's naughty in wanting to see the moon? It's not hurting anyone. It's not even being disobedient, because Aunt Margaret has never actually told us not to go out at night and look at the moon." Philip thought this over for a minute or two, and it seemed to make sense to him, for all he said was, "Are you going to dress properly?" "Oh, no," I said. "I shan't bother. I shall tuck my nightie up and put on my jacket. You put on your best trousers and those long ones over your PJs and put on your jacket too." This was no sooner said than done, and looking rather lumpy down below with our handkerchiefs stuffed onto our mouths because we wanted to giggle, Philip and I tiptoed to the front door and turned the key. It creaked and grated alarmingly, but my uncle and aunt must have been very soundly asleep, for although we stood still for a few moments, nothing happened. We shut the door silently behind us and stepped out into the open. Then we both stopped and looked around because the world seemed so strange and different, and the sky with its millions of stars looked so far away. I slipped my hand into Philip's, as I always did when things seemed strange, and together we tiptoed through the shadowed orchard towards our gap. The shadows of the apple boughs looked so fierce and frightening that I almost ran back. Philip, having made up his mind, kept going. Out through the gate and through the stony track that led to the hills we went without a word. Up the steps behind the clock tower, over the first group of gray stones, and we were there, standing on the lower slopes by the moonlight, with the silver world standing at our feet. We climbed in silence until we reached the very top of North Hill and stood by the little pile of stones that marked the summit. The wind came sweeping up the valleys clean and pure. A sheep lifted up its head at the sound of our footsteps and bleated. Otherwise, all was silent, and we sat down on the stones to look. There was such a tremendous lot to see in spite of the darkness. Behind there were the black shapes of the hills, and in front of us stretched the plains dotted with points of light, and every river and pond gleamed silver in the moonlight. But mostly we looked up because we both loved stars, and tonight they all shone clearly, right across the sky. We pointed them out to each other with eager fingers. We felt wonderful to be up there alone with the stars, and we stayed quite a long time, until Philip remarked that he thought we'd better be getting back, as it would soon be morning and we should be tired the next day. Actually, it was not quite as bad as that, for when we reached the bottom of the hill, the clock on the tower struck 1, nearly making us jump out of our skins. We sang all the way down because we knew that no one would hear us, and it was a relief to make noise after being so quiet. We sang all the songs we could remember, jumping over the grouse bushes and leaping from one rock to the other like 2 mountain goats. When we got back to the stony track, we suddenly felt tired and thought how nice it would be to cuddle down into bed and go to sleep. "Now," said Philip, "we must creep very, very quietly." We were right through the gate and well into the orchard when Philip suddenly stopped dead and dug his fingernails into my arm. With the other hand he pointed, and as I followed his finger, my heart seemed to turn over. I only just stopped myself from screaming. A tall figure in a dark cloak was moving towards us through the trees, bowed under the weight of a sack. She had not seen us, for we had come very quietly, and we stood hidden in the deep shadows of the apple trees. But the figure was making for the gap, and in a few minutes must pass right by where we stood. I thought I would have fainted if it had not been for Philip, who seemed much less frightened than I was. "It was a woman stealing apples," he breathed. "We ought to try to stop her. They're Auntie's apples, and she's got a great big sack full." I could not argue or tell him to stop because I was much too scared to speak. I clung tightly to Philip, and he was sort of dragged with him when he suddenly stepped out into the open to stop the thief, who was nearly upon us. The moonlight shone full on her face, and we recognized her in a flash. It was Terry's mother. She gave a short, terrified shriek and dropped the sack so that the apples rolled and scattered in all directions. And then she cowered down in the grass and covered her face with her cloak and began mumbling words very fast, almost as though she were saying her prayers. Neither Philip or I knew what to do until she suddenly flung back her fierce, proud head and spoke to us. "So you'd been spying on me even at night, would you?" she hissed, shaking her fist at us. "And now you'd be sending the police after me tomorrow, and they'll take me from my poor dying boy. You with your fine food and your grand clothing, you can't spare the price of a few apples for my laddie who's what's starving and cold, and him dying before my very eyes, and with you nothing to give him. Oh, Terry, Terry, they'll take you from me." And she hid her face in her cloak again and burst into a bitter, loud weeping. I looked at Philip, feeling more trouble than I had ever felt before, and Philip was frowning too, as though he was wondering what to do next. Presently, however, he made up his mind, for he suddenly squatted down in the grass beside the poor huddled figure and tried to take her hands away from her face. "We weren't spying on you," he said gently. "We were only here by accident because we wanted to see the moon." The woman stopped sobbing and looked closely at Philip with a gleam of hope in her wild eyes. "Little gentleman," she answered in a trembling voice, taking hold of him, "listen to me. I swear before God I'll never come again. I know I'm a wicked woman. I shan't come. But Terry's dying, and the doctor, he says to me, you get him extra milk and a warm blanket for winter, and you feed him up proper if you want to keep him a little longer. And my Terry, he's all I've got." She was kneeling in the grass, clasping her hands almost as though she were praying to us. I wanted to tell her that of course we wouldn't tell, and she could have all the apples she wanted, because I felt sorry for her, but Philip stopped me. "We won't tell," he said slowly, "but if you really stop stealing, as you say, I can't see how you're going to get any money. And yet, of course, it's very wicked to steal. Won't anybody give you any money?" She shook her head. "If I asked for benefits, they'd only put Terry back in the hospital where I couldn't get to him. They'd say our house isn't fit for a sick child to live in, which it isn't. And at least we're together, and that's what we want." She looked at us desperately, as though begging us to understand. Philip seemed to be thinking hard. "Listen," he said at last in his most serious voice. "I've got sort of an idea, but I can't tell you about it now. You go back to Terry, and we'll come and see you tomorrow when we've talked about it, and we promise not to tell." "God bless you, little lady and gentleman," whispered Terry's mother, "and forgive me for being a wicked woman." She picked up her empty sack and was gone through the gap in the hedge before we had time to say good night to her. We were left alone, gazing at the scattered fruit. "I wish we'd let her have 'em," I remarked. "No," said Philip, "it's Uncle Peter's fruit, and it would have been just as bad as stealing ourselves if we'd given it to her. I've thought of something else, Ruth, and I'll tell you in the morning. I'm so tired I want to go back to bed." I was very tired too, so I didn't ask him any more questions, and we crept upstairs and tumbled into bed. I was just falling asleep when Philip's head came around the door. "How much is there in the money box?" he whispered. £1, 17 shillings and 4 pence, I mumbled back sleepily, and the next moment I was deep in the land of dreams. Tomorrow is chapter 15, and the name is About Giving. I love you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.